In the silence before dawn, when shadows cling to ancient stones like the memory of forgotten prayers, there exists a blade that defies all understanding. It rests now behind glass, its golden surface catching museum light with the cold gleam of something that has seen too much. But to know the crooked dagger of yore, one must return to a time when the world was young and gods walked among mortals. Like a jewel carved from the earth itself, its cigarettes pierced the sky, reaching toward heaven with the desperation of a people who knew that divine favor was as fragile as morning mist. In this cradle of civilization, where the first words were pressed into wet clay and the first laws were carved in stone, here, in the royal cemetery of yore, that British archaeologist Leonard Woolley first glimpsed the impossible. The year was 1922, and the desert wind carried whispers of discovery as his team carefully brushed away millennia of sand and silence. Their builders' minds, gold gleamed in the lamplight. Lapis lazuli shimmered like captured starlight. And among these treasures, something that should not have been. The dagger lay beside the remains of what had once been a nobler person of such importance that their death had required company for the journey beyond. But it was not the skeleton that drew gasps from the excavation team. It was the weapon itself, curved in a way that spoke of intention rather than accident. Its blade bent at an angle that no smith would choose, no warrior would accept. The gold surface was pristine, untarnished by age, as though time itself had been reluctant to touch it, inlaid with lapis lazuli, the color of midnight sky. It possessed a beauty that made the eye linger and the heart quicken with unease, yet beauty was not what haunted the excavators in their dreams. It was the placement of the blade, found clutched in the skeletal fingers of a young woman whose wide-set eye sockets seemed to stare upward in perpetual surprise. She had been no noble, no royal consort destined for glory. She was a servant, sacrificed to accompany her master into whatever realm awaited beyond the veil of death. But why had she held the crooked dagger? Why had her final moments been spent grasping this twisted thing of gold and stone? Academic halls suggested the blade had been ceremonial, a symbol of power bent to show submission to higher forces. Others, their eyes bright with the fever of mystery, whispered of deliberate breaking of a weapon so potent that it had to be crippled to prevent its misuse. Had it been the instrument of the servant's death, then twisted to ensure it could never kill again? Or had it been bent to contain something far more dangerous than sharp metal, a spirit, perhaps, or a curse that required physical binding to remain trapped within its golden prison? In the flickering candlelight of late-night study sessions, when shadows danced across ancient texts and the desert wind sang through cracks in modern walls, more unsettling possibilities emerged. What if the dagger had not been bent by human hands at all? What if its twisted form was the result of forces beyond mortal understanding, divine anger, perhaps, or the weight of supernatural purpose? The Sumerians, who had crafted this blade, knew secrets that died with their civilization, knowledge of gods who demanded blood and spirits who bargained in souls. The servant girl's bones told their own story to those who knew how to listen. Her skeleton showed no signs of struggle, no defensive wounds or evidence of violent death. She had gone willingly into that tomb, or perhaps had been prepared so carefully that resistance was impossible. The ritual drink that had likely ended Her life would have been sweet on her tongue, masking the bitter herbs that brought sleep and then silence. But why had she been chosen to hold the crooked dagger? Was she its guardian, appointed to keep it safe through eternity? Or was she its prisoner, bound to the blade by chains stronger than gold? As moonlight filtered through museum windows and night guards walked their silent rounds, the dagger continued to gleam with its patient, eternal light. Visitors came and went, drawn by its beauty, unsettled by its wrongness. Children pressed their faces to the glass, asking why the pretty knife was broken. Adults studied the accompanying placard, reading about ancient burial customs and archaeological significance. But few lingered long in its presence. There was something about the blade that made the air feel heavy, that turned casual interest into nervous glances over the shoulder. The truth, if such a thing existed, lay buried deeper than any archaeologist's spade could reach. In the royal cemetery of yore, where kings and queens slept surrounded by their golden treasures, the crooked dagger had been placed with purpose and reverence. Every detail of its burial had meaning: the position of the servant's hands, the angle of the blade, the precise arrangement of precious stones that surrounded it like a constellation of earthbound stars. These ancient people, who had given humanity its first cities and first laws, had left behind a riddle wrapped in gold and sealed with death. And so the crooked dagger rests, neither fully weapon nor ornament, neither broken nor whole. Its golden surface reflects the faces of those who dare to look too closely, showing them their own mortality in its twisted form. The servant girl who once held it has long since returned to dust, but her vigil continues in the silence between heartbeats, in the space between questions and answers, in the shimmer of lapis lazuli and the gleam of imperishable gold. Something waits patient as stone, eternal as the desert winds that first sang over the walls of your dot. The mystery endures, as perhaps it was always meant to, reminding us that some secrets are too dangerous to solve, some locks too important to open. In its crooked beauty, the dagger whispers of purposes beyond our understanding, of powers that shaped metal and fate with equal ease, of a time when the line between the living and the dead was as thin as hammered gold and twice as precious. In the hours before sunrise, when the desert holds its breath and ancient stones remember their first prayers, there is a place where death wears the face of the living. Here, in the shadow of what may be humanity's oldest city, archaeologists uncovered a secret that has haunted them through sleepless nights and restless dreams. For in Jericho, the dead do not rest quietly in their graves. They watch, they wait, and some say they whisper. The tale of Jericho rises from the Jordan Valley like a sleeping giant, its layers containing 10,000 years of human hope and sorrow. Each stratum tells a story of civilizations that rose and fell like wheat before the harvest, leaving behind pottery shards, foundation stones, and mysteries that grow deeper with every shovel of earth removed. But it was in the Neolithic levels, in deposits older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids, that archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon made a discovery that would forever change our understanding of humanity's relationship with death. Beneath the floors of ancient houses, buried with the same care as precious treasures, lay human skulls unlike any seen before. These were not the hollow bone relics of natural death, but something far more deliberate, far more unsettling. the flesh painstakingly removed, and then most remarkably rebuilt, had been molded over the bone with the skill of a master sculptor, recreating the features of the face with haunting accuracy. Where once eyes had looked upon the world, shells from distant seas now gazed with pearlescent intensity, their surfaces catching torchlight like captured stars. The work was exquisite, each detail lovingly crafted. The plaster had been tinted and shaped to suggest the fullness of life, cheeks that might have smiled, lips that might have spoken blessings or warnings. Hair, human hair, had been pressed into the wet plaster, giving these reconstructed faces a terrible vitality that made excavators step back involuntarily. In the pre-dawn silence of archaeological camps, when coffee grew cold over field notes and theories multiplied like shadows, the question echoed without answer. Why would a people devote such care, such artistry, to the faces of the dead? The skulls were not randomly buried, but placed with intention beneath the thresholds of homes, positioned where the living would walk over them daily, where their presence would be felt, if not seen. They were guardians, perhaps, or witnesses to the daily rituals of their descendants. The shells that replaced their eyes came from the Mediterranean, carried across miles of desert by hands that understood the value of such treasures. Cowrie shells, with their smooth curves and natural openings, had been carefully selected and positioned to create the illusion of sight. Yet what did these artificial eyes see? Did they watch the living with blessing or with judgment? In the flickering light of oil lamps, visitors to archaeological sites have reported feeling observed, as though the plaster faces retained some echo of their original consciousness. Among the most haunting discoveries was a cluster of 7 skulls, found arranged in a circle beneath what appeared to be a shrine room. Each face was different, young and old, male and female, their plaster features bearing the individuality of real people who had once walked Jericho's ancient streets, but their placement suggested ritual, ceremony, perhaps even summoning. Had these been beloved ancestors, called back to guide their living relatives through the dangers of existence? Or were they something else, entirely oracles, perhaps, whose wisdom was too valuable to lose to the grave? The red pigment found on several skulls carried its own mysteries. Analysis revealed it to be ochre mixed with organic compounds, applied in patterns that seemed deliberate rather than decorative. Some skulls bore dots of red on the forehead. Others had lines drawn across the cheeks like ritual scarification. The color of blood, of life force, of the sacred hunted, transformed these already otherworldly faces into something that belonged neither to the living nor the dead, but to some realm between. Children's skulls were among those discovered, their small faces reconstructed with the same meticulous care as the adults. This detail perhaps disturbs most of all the image of tiny plaster faces with shell eyes, watching from beneath the floors where other children played and learned. Were these youngsters taken by disease, by accident, by some ritual we cannot fathom? Their presence suggests that death in Neolithic Jericho was not an ending, but a transformation, not a departure, but a change of duty. The houses above these buried guardians showed signs of continuous habitation over generations. Families lived, loved, celebrated, and mourned while walking daily over the faces of those who had come before. The arrangement suggests a cosmology we can barely imagine, one in which the boundary between life and death was as permeable as morning mist, where ancestors remained active participants in the world of the living, their reconstructed faces serving as conduits between realms. Modern visitors to Jericho's archaeological sites sometimes report strange experiences in the pre-dawn hours, whispers that might be wind through ancient stones or something else entirely. The sensation of being watched by eyes that cannot be seen. Dreams filled with shell-eyed faces and red-painted warnings. The local Bedouin, whose ancestors have dwelt in these lands since time immemorial, speak of the watchers beneath with a mixture of reverence and caution, crossing themselves when the conversation turns to such matters. The technique of skull plastering was not unique to Jericho. Similar finds have emerged from other Neolithic sites across the Levant, but nowhere else were they buried with such systematic care. Nowhere else do they seem so clearly integrated into the daily life of the living. This suggests that Jericho held special significance, that its position at the crossroads of ancient trade routes made it a nexus not just of commerce, but of spiritual power, a place where the veil between worlds grew thin. As dawn breaks over the Jordan Valley and modern excavators begin another day of careful digging and meticulous recording, the plaster faces wait in climate-controlled storage, their shell eyes reflecting fluorescent lights instead of torch flames. But in the quiet moments between shifts, when the site is empty save for wind and shadow, those who work among these ancient mysteries sometimes pause, feeling the weight of 10,000 years of watching, waiting, whispering presence. The skulls of Jericho remain one of humanity's earliest attempts to deny death its finality, to preserve not just memory, but identity itself. In plaster and shell and sacred red, they speak of love that transcends mortality, of wisdom too precious to lose, of a people who understood something about the nature of existence that we, in our modern sophistication, have perhaps forgotten. In their artificial eyes lies a question that echoes across millennia. What would you preserve of those you love, and what price would you pay to keep them watching over you forever? Deep in the rain-soaked heart of the Maya world, where howler monkeys announce the dawn and cecropia trees pierce the canopy like ancient spears reaching toward forgotten gods, lies a pyramid that guards one of archaeology's most magnificent mysteries. The Temple of Inscriptions at Palenque rises from the jungle floor like a stone mountain dreamed into existence by architects who spoke with the stars themselves. Within its corbelled chambers, sealed beneath tons of limestone and centuries of silence, Mexican archaeologist Alberto Ruiz Lulier made a discovery in 1952 that would forever change our understanding of Maya beliefs about death, divinity, and the delicate threshold between mortal flesh and cosmic eternity. The descent into Kyanich Janab Pakal's tomb is a journey through layers of time itself. 68 steps, carved from living rock, lead downward into the pyramid's heart, each footfall echoing with the weight of 13 centuries. The walls press close, their surfaces alive with hieroglyphs that speak of astronomical calculations and divine genealogies, of kings who claimed descent from the gods and deaths that were doorways to stellar transformation. The air grows thick with the breath of ages, humid and heavy with secrets that have waited in darkness for their moment of revelation. At the bottom of this stone stairway to eternity lies a chamber that defies every expectation of burial and transcendence. The walls glow with stucco reliefs of the 9 lords of the night, deities who govern the dark hours when souls journey between worlds. Their faces, serene yet terrible, watch over a limestone sarcophagus so massive it seems to have grown from the bedrock itself. The lid alone weighs 5 tons, its surface covered with one of the most complex and beautiful carvings ever achieved by human hands, a masterwork that tells the story of a king's death and rebirth in symbols that dance between history and mythology. But it is what lies within the sarcophagus that stops the breath and quickens the pulse with recognition of the sacred. There, arranged with precision that speaks of rituals beyond our understanding, lay the remains of Kanich Janab Pakel, who ruled Palenque for 68 years and died in 683 CE at the age of 80, a lifespan that seemed impossible in an era when most mortals barely reached 40. His bones, stained red with cinnabar dust, bore witness to a death that was as much transformation as ending. And covering his face, fitted with the skill of master jewelers, was a mosaic mask of jade pieces so perfectly cut and placed that they seemed to breathe with inner light. The mask itself is a masterpiece that transcends mere craftsmanship to become something approaching divine artistry. More than 340 individual pieces of jade, each carved and polished to perfection, fit together like the scales of some celestial serpent. The green stone ranges from pale celadon to deep forest hues, creating subtle variations in tone that give the mask depth and vitality. Obsidian forms the pupils of eyes that seem to follow the observer with the patience of eternity itself. Shell provides the brilliant white of teeth and the gleaming sclera that makes those jade eyes so unnervingly alive. Each piece was secured with a technique that reveals the Maya's sophisticated understanding of both engineering and symbolism. The jade fragments are not merely glued in place, but held by a complex system of flanges and grooves that allows the mask to flex slightly, giving it an organic quality that makes it seem capable of expression. The ears are adorned with jade earfleurs depicting the head of the jester god, a deity associated with kingship and the axis that connects heaven, earth, and underworld. From the nose hangs a jade ornament carved in the form of a T-shaped symbol representing wind and breath, the invisible force that animates all living things. But the mask's true power lies not in its individual elements, but in their cosmic significance. To the Maya, jade was more precious than gold, more valuable than blood itself. It represented water, vegetation, the breath of life, the green world that sustained humanity's existence. To be buried wearing jade was to be dressed in the very essence of life force, to be prepared for a resurrection that would transform mortal flesh into divine presence. Pakel's mask was not merely decorative, it was a machine for transformation, a device designed to facilitate his metamorphosis from earthly king to stellar deity. The mystery deepens when one considers the sarcophagus lid that covered this jade-wrapped transformation. The carving shows Pakel at the moment of death, falling backward into the jaws of the underworld, perhaps rising toward the stars along the world tree that connects all levels of Maya cosmology. His pose is ambiguous, suggesting simultaneously descent and ascent, death and birth, ending and beginning. Some scholars see in this image the king's journey to Xibalba, the Maya underworld, where he must face trials and challenges before achieving divine status. Others interpret it as his ascension to become one with the cosmos, his jade-wrapped face joining the eternal dance of celestial bodies. The chamber itself contributes to the mystery through its precise astronomical alignments. During the winter solstice, sunlight penetrates the pyramid's carefully calculated angles to illuminate the sarcophagus for exactly 66 seconds, the same number of years Pakel ruled Palenque before his death. This is no coincidence, but evidence of planning that began decades before his death. Preparation for a transformation that required mathematical precision and architectural perfection. The builders understood that death was not random but part of a cosmic schedule that could be predicted and prepared for with the same accuracy they brought to calculating eclipses and planetary movements. Modern visitors to Pakal's tomb often report experiencing what can only be described as presents a sense that the jade mask continues to serve its intended purpose, that somewhere behind those obsidian pupils and shell teeth, consciousness persists in a form we cannot comprehend. The air in the chamber feels charged, electric with possibility, as though the boundary between matter and spirit grows thin in the presence of such concentrated sacred power. Photography often produces unexpected results, strange lights, unexplained reflections, images that seem to show more than the camera operator intended to capture. The mask now rests in Mexico's National Museum of Anthropology, displayed under carefully controlled lighting that brings out every subtle variation in the jade's green fire. Thousands of visitors pass before it daily, drawn by its beauty, but often leaving with a sense of unease they cannot quite articulate. Children seem particularly affected, staring at the mask with wide eyes before tugging at their parents' hands, whispering that the green man is still looking. In the pre-dawn hours when museums sleep and security guards walk their silent rounds, some report that the mask seems different, more alive, more present, as though the protective barriers between day and night allow its true nature to emerge. Cleaning staff speak in hushed tones of mornings when they arrive to find the display case covered with condensation that forms no pattern on any other exhibit, as though the mask itself breathes against the glass that contains it. The jade continues to hold its secrets, each green fragment reflecting not just light but questions that span more than a millennium. Was Pakal truly transformed by his jade cocoon, his consciousness preserved in crystalline matrix? Does the mask serve as a window through which ancient wisdom still observes our modern world? Or is it simply stone and obsidian and shell, made sacred only by our need to believe that some things transcend the finality of death? In the end, the emerald mask of Pakal represents humanity's eternal struggle with mortality and meaning. It embodies our deepest hope that consciousness might survive the destruction of flesh, that careful preparation and sacred materials might build bridges across the abyss that separates life from whatever lies beyond. In its jade depths, we see reflected our own faces, temporary, fragile, desperately seeking transformation into something more permanent than bone and memory. In the vast silence of the Atacama Desert, where rain falls perhaps once in a decade, and the earth remembers every footfall from 10,000 years past, there lies a necropolis that predates the pyramids of Egypt by 2 millennia. Here, along the Pacific coast of what is now Chile, the Chinchorro people developed a relationship with death so profound, so reverent, that it transformed their culture into something unique in human history. They were not pharaohs or priests or kings. They were fishers and hunters, gatherers of the seas, bounty, and the desert's sparse gifts. Yet their treatment of the dead reveals a sophistication that challenges every assumption about ancient civilizations and the development of complex burial practices. The discovery came gradually, as the desert surrendered its secrets to wind and time and the careful eyes of archaeologists who understood that in this driest place on earth, preservation was possible beyond all reasonable hope. The first mummy was found in 1917, naturally desiccated by the desert's embrace, but it would be decades before the full scope of Chinchorro mortuary practices became clear. What emerged from the sand was not a single burial tradition, but an evolving art form that spanned more than 4,000 years, during which these ancient people refined and perfected techniques for preserving the dead that would make Egyptian embalmers seem like mere apprentices. The black mummies came first, appearing around 5000 BCI, when the rest of the world was just beginning to experiment with agriculture and settled life. These earliest preserved bodies bore witness to a treatment so radical, so complete, that it amounted to nothing less than reconstruction. The Chinchorro mortuary priests, for surely they were priests, though they left no temples or monuments to mark their sacred calling, would carefully dismantle each corpse, removing skin, organs, and muscle with obsidian blades sharp enough to split hairs. The bones were then dried, reinforced with sticks and reeds, and reassembled like some macabre puzzle that required perfect knowledge of human anatomy. But this was only the beginning of the transformation. The body cavity was packed with ash, clay, and organic materials, creating an artificial interior that would not decay. New skin was crafted from clay, mixed with organic binders, molded over the reconstructed skeleton with an attention to detail that suggests these were not anonymous, dead but beloved individuals whose physical forms were too precious to lose to time. The genitals were carefully recreated, suggesting that identity persisted beyond death in ways that required physical representation. Finally, the entire form was painted with manganese-based pigments that turned the artificial skin a deep, lustrous black, the color of fertile earth. Of the volcanic sands that bordered their coastal realm, the red mummies appeared later, around 2500 BCE, representing an evolution in technique that suggests growing sophistication or perhaps changing spiritual beliefs. These bodies underwent less radical dismantling, but were still fundamentally transformed through the application of red ochre iron oxide mixed with organic compounds that created a paint the color of fresh blood, of sunrise, of the life force itself. The red mummies retained more of their original tissue, but their faces were covered with clay masks painted to represent features that might have been worn away by death. Hair was replaced with black paint or human hair from other sources, and the entire body was wrapped in textiles and reed mats that created a cocoon of preservation. What haunts modern observers is not just the technical sophistication of these treatments, but their democratic nature. Egyptian mummification was reserved for pharaohs and nobles. for those who could afford the expensive spices and lengthy procedures that promised eternal life. But among the Chinchorro, everyone was preserved men and women, adults and children, even fetuses and newborns who had barely drawn breath. The tiniest mummies are perhaps the most heartbreaking, their miniature forms preserved with the same meticulous care as the adults, their clay faces painted with expressions of peaceful sleep that suggest death was seen not as ending but as transformation into a different state of being. The copper masks represent the most mysterious aspect of Chinchorro mortuary practice. These thin sheets of hammered copper, green with verdigris and gleaming with metallic fire, were fitted over faces, both living and dead, creating a barrier between flesh and the world that speaks of protection, preservation, and perhaps concealment. The copper came from distant mines in the Andes, carried across hundreds of miles of desert by traders who understood its sacred value. But why copper? Why create masks that would outlast the flesh they covered by millennia? Some scholars suggest the copper served a practical purpose, preventing insect infestation and bacterial decay through its antimicrobial properties. Others see deeper significance in the choice of material. Copper conducts both heat and electrical current, perhaps serving as a bridge between the physical and spiritual realms in ways that stone or clay could not. In Andean cosmology, metals are alive, growing in the earth like seeds planted by mountain spirits. To cover a face with copper might have been to dress the dead in material that retained its own form of consciousness, its own connection to the living world. The masks themselves vary dramatically in style and execution. Some are simple sheets hammered to follow the contours of skull and cheek, creating abstract representations that reduce human features to essential elements. Others show more sophisticated workmanship, with raised areas representing eyes, nose, and mouth worked into the metal with techniques that suggest specialized craftsmen devoted their lives to this sacred art. The patination varies as well. Some masks retain their original copper color in patches, while others have turned completely green, creating faces that seem to belong to some race of metallic beings rather than preserved humans. Children's copper masks carry their own particular poignancy. These tiny faces, green with age and gleaming with reflected light, speak of parents who could not bear to let their young ones fade into anonymity. The copper preserved not just features, but expression, the peaceful calm of sleep, the slight upturn of lips that might have smiled in life. To hold such a mask is to feel the weight of grief transformed into something permanent, something that could outlast memory and time itself. The preservation achieved by Chinchorro mortuary practices is extraordinary even by modern standards. Bodies buried 7,000 years ago retain hair, skin, and even internal organs. Their tissues dried but not decayed, their forms intact, enough to reveal details of diet, disease, and daily life that would otherwise be lost to time. The copper masks, meanwhile, show no signs of deterioration despite millennia in the desert air. They gleam with the same metallic fire they possessed when first hammered into shape by hands that have long since returned to dust. Modern analysis reveals details that add to the mystery rather than solving it. The copper used in the masks shows trace elements consistent with Andean sources, confirming the extensive trade networks that connected coastal fishing communities with with highland mining cultures. But isotope analysis also reveals that some copper came from sources that have never been identified, suggesting mining operations or trade routes that have vanished from both archaeological record and human memory. Visitors to museums where mummies are displayed often report feeling unsettled by the copper masks, which seem to watch with metallic eyes that reflect light in patterns too deliberate to be accidental. The green faces appear almost alive under certain lighting conditions, their verdigris-stained features suggesting expression and emotion in ways that stone or wood never could. Children are particularly affected, often refusing to approach display cases containing copper-masked mummies, claiming they can hear whispers or feel the cold touch of metal fingers reaching through the glass. The mystery deepens when one considers the longevity of Chinchorro burial practices. For millennia, these people maintained traditions of mummification and copper masking that required enormous investments of time, skill, and precious materials. This was not a brief cultural phase, but a way of life that defined their relationship with death for longer than recorded history. What drove such persistence? What did they understand about mortality and preservation that sustained these practices across 160 generations? In the pre-dawn hours of the Atacama, when the desert air grows cold and stars shine with crystalline intensity through atmosphere so dry it seems to crack, the copper masks continue their eternal vigil. They reflect starlight and moonbeams with the same metallic fire they caught from torches and oil lamps in ancient ceremonies whose purposes we can only imagine. In their green gleaming lies a promise that some things endure beyond flesh, beyond memory, beyond the slow erosion of time itself. That love, properly channeled through sacred materials and devoted hands, can create monuments more lasting than pyramids, more precious than gold, in the shifting sands west of Alexandria, where the Mediterranean wind carries salt and secrets from civilizations swallowed by time. Archaeologists working at the necropolis of Topoceres Magna have uncovered a mystery that speaks quite literally to humanity's eternal fear of being silenced by death. Here, in burial chambers, sealed for nearly 2 millennia, they have found the dead prepared for eternity with golden tongues pressed between their teeth, gleaming organs of speech crafted from the most imperishable metal known to ancient Egyptian craftsmen. These are not mere ornaments or symbols, but functional replacements for flesh that would decay, practical preparations for conversations that must continue beyond the grave. Of Cleopatra's lost tomb, but revealed instead something, perhaps, more profound, evidence of burial practices that evolved during Egypt's final centuries, when Greek philosophy merged with pharaonic tradition to create new approaches to death and preservation. The necropolis itself dates primarily to the Ptolemaic and Roman periods, when Egypt stood at the crossroads of civilizations and burial customs reflected influences from across the known world. Yet the golden tongues represent something uniquely Egyptian, a solution to the problem of how to speak in the afterlife when the organs of speech have turned to dust. Each tongue was crafted with meticulous attention to both form and function. The gold, hammered to paper thinness, yet retaining the strength to maintain its shape through millennia, was molded to replicate the size and contours of the original organ. Some tongues show evidence of texturing that mimics the surface of living flesh, with tiny raised areas representing taste buds and the natural roughness that allows human speech to form consonants and vowels with precision. Others are smooth as water, abstract representations that reduce the tongue to its essential function, the bridge between thought and expression, between internal consciousness and external communication. The placement of these golden organs required careful preparation that speaks of ritual expertise passed down through generations of mortuary priests. The mummy's jaws were gently separated, often requiring the breaking of rigor mortis or the careful manipulation of dried tissue. The golden tongue was then positioned with anatomical precision, placed not merely between the teeth but in the exact location where the original organ had rested, held in place by resins and bindings that would secure it through the violent process of resurrection described in Egyptian funerary texts. But why gold? In the sophisticated metallurgy of ancient Egypt, this was not an arbitrary choice, but a decision rooted in deep understanding of material properties and spiritual significance. Gold alone among metals does not tarnish, corrode, or decay. It remains unchanged by time, moisture, or the chemical processes that destroy other materials. The tongue, as the organ of speech, prayer, and magical incantation, required a material that could preserve its function across the vast spans of time that separated death from resurrection. The golden tongues also served a practical purpose within Egyptian concepts of the afterlife judgment. According to the Book of the Dead and related funerary texts, the deceased must speak their name before the gods, recite protective spells, and answer questions posed by divine judges who would determine their worthiness for eternal life. A mummy without a tongue would be silenced before this cosmic tribunal, unable to defend themselves or claim their place among the blessed dead. The golden replacement ensured that no decay of flesh could prevent the soul from speaking the words that would grant passage to eternal paradise. The craftsmanship varies dramatically among the discovered tongues, suggesting different levels of wealth, social status, or perhaps regional traditions within the broader Egyptian burial complex. Some are masterpieces of metalworking with surfaces so perfectly smooth they act as mirrors, reflecting light with the brilliance of captured sunbeams. These premium tongues show evidence of engraving tiny hieroglyphs etched into the gold that spell out protective formulas or the names of gods whose favor was essential for successful resurrection. The most elaborate examples feature raised designs that replicate the blood vessels and muscle fibers of living tongues, creating artificial organs so realistic they seem capable of speech, even in their golden stillness. Other tongues are cruder, hammered from thicker gold with less attention to anatomical accuracy. These may represent the burial preparations of middle-class Egyptians prosperous enough to afford golden tongues, but lacking the resources for the finest craftsmanship. Yet even these simpler examples show careful attention to proportion and placement, suggesting that the spiritual function was considered more important than aesthetic perfection. A roughly made golden tongue was infinitely preferable to no tongue at all. When facing the gods who would judge the dead, the most mysterious discoveries are the mummies found with crumpled golden tongues. Their careful metalwork, twisted and folded as though bitten by supernatural force, These damaged tongues pose questions that archaeologists whisper about in late-night discussions but rarely address in published papers. Were they deliberately damaged during the mummification process, perhaps to silence specific individuals whose words were feared even in death? Did they suffer damage during burial, crushed by the weight of wrappings or the settling of tomb materials? Or do they represent some form of divine judgment, evidence that not all golden tongues succeeded in purchasing their owner's passage to eternal speech? Modern analysis of the golden tongues reveals details that add layers to the mystery. Fluorescence spectroscopy shows that the gold used in their construction varies in purity and trace element composition, suggesting sources from different mines or recycling of older golden objects. Some tongues contain silver inclusions that create a pale, almost white metal known as electroma natural alloy that the Egyptians associated with divine flesh and celestial light. These electrum tongues may have been reserved for individuals of particular spiritual significance, priests or priestesses whose words carried special power in both life and death. The positioning within the mouth also varies in ways that suggest different theological approaches or regional burial traditions. Some tongues were placed flat against the floor of the mouth, while others were positioned upright as though ready for speech. A few were found curled or folded, perhaps representing a dormant state from which they would unfurl during resurrection. The most intriguing placements are those found extending slightly between the teeth, as though the dead person was captured in the act of speaking their first words in the afterlife. Chemical analysis of the resins and binding materials used to secure the tongues reveals sophisticated embalming techniques that drew on Egypt's mastery of preservation chemistry. Some tongues were secured with pine resin imported from Lebanon, others with local natron and beeswax compounds. The choice of materials seems to correlate with the quality of the tongue itself, suggesting that wealthy patrons could afford both superior metalwork and premium preservation materials, while others made do with local alternatives that served the same basic function. The discovery of golden tongues has also shed light on the social stratification of Roman period Egyptian burial practices. The presence or absence of a golden tongue appears to correlate with other indicators of wealth and status: elaborate mummy wrappings, expensive amulets, tomb paintings, and inscribed stela. Yet the distribution is not perfectly hierarchical. Some otherwise modest burials include beautifully crafted golden tongues, while certain elaborate tombs contain mummies with no tongue replacement at all. This suggests that the decision to include a golden tongue was not merely a matter of wealth, but of personal belief, family tradition, or perhaps specific religious affiliations that valued speech in the afterlife above other concerns. Modern visitors to museums displaying golden tongues often report unusual experiences: dreams of ancient voices, the sensation of words forming without sound, or the uncomfortable feeling that the gleaming metal organs are attempting communication across the barriers of death and display glass. Some visitors claim to hear whispers in languages they cannot identify, while others report that the tongues seem to move slightly when viewed in peripheral vision, as though testing their readiness for speech that has been delayed for 2,000 years. The golden tongues of Egypt represent one of humanity's most literal attempts to ensure that death would not silence the voice of consciousness. They embody the belief that speech, prayer, conversation, argument, poetry is so fundamental to human identity that it must be preserved even when the flesh that enables it has returned to dust. In their gleaming surfaces, we see reflected our own fear of being forgotten, our hope that something essential about who we are will persist beyond the failure of body and breath. In the museum cases, where they now rest, under carefully controlled lighting that brings out every detail of their ancient craftsmanship, the golden tongues wait with the patience of metal and the urgency of messages never delivered. They are reminders that the human need to speak, to be heard, to leave words that outlast mortality, transcends culture and centuries, connecting us across time to people who shared our deepest fears and most desperate hopes. In their silent gleaming lies the promise that some voices, properly prepared and lovingly preserved, may yet find ways to speak across the vast silences that separate the living from the dead in the peat bogs of Denmark, where time moves as slowly as amber forming around prehistoric insects, and the earth preserves what it claims with the jealous care of a lover. There lies a man who has slept for over 2,000 years, with a rope around his neck and peace upon his face. The Tolland man, as archaeologists have named him, emerges from the bog like a dream made flesh, so perfectly preserved that his discoverers first thought they had stumbled upon a recent murder victim, so lifelike that his eyes seem ready to open and his lips to speak the secrets of his final moments. The discovery came on a spring morning in 1950, when peat cutters working in Bajiled Skovdal bog near the village of Tolland noticed something that made their hearts leap with recognition and terror. What they had taken for a piece of bog would reveal itself to be a human foot, then a leg, then the complete body of a man curled in sleep position, as though he had simply lain down for rest and never awakened. The bog's acidic, oxygen-poor environment had transformed him into leather and memory, preserving every detail of his features while stripping away the softness of living flesh and replacing it with the brown durability of tanned hide. His face arrests the breath and quickens the pulse with its expression of profound tranquility. This is not the rictus of violent death, but something approaching serenity, eyes closed as though in meditation, lips slightly parted as though releasing a final breath or prayer. The fine lines around his eyes, speaking of a man who had lived long enough to understand both sorrow and joy. The preservation is so complete that individual whiskers are visible on his chin, each hair caught in its exact position at the moment of death, creating a portrait of mortality that transcends time and culture to speak directly to the modern heart. The rope tells a different story, made of leather and plant fiber, twisted with the skill of someone who understood the construction of bonds that would not slip or break. It encircles his neck with purposeful tightness that leaves no doubt about its lethal intent. The noose was fashioned not from desperation, but from careful preparation. A tool designed for a specific purpose by hands that knew their deadly craft. Yet the rope's placement shows no signs of struggle, no indication that the Tolland man fought against his binding. The leather lies smooth against his preserved skin, positioned with the precision of ritual rather than the chaos of violence. But it is his final meal that provides the most haunting clues to the circumstances of his death. Analysis of his stomach contents reveals a porridge made from barley, linseed, pale persicaria, and other plants that would have created a mixture too bitter for normal consumption. A gruel that speaks of ritual preparation rather than ordinary sustenance. This was not food intended to nourish, but to prepare. A ceremonial meal that connected the consumer to forces beyond the mundane world of daily bread and comfortable flavors. The bitter herbs and seeds would have created a mixture that required determination to swallow, suggesting that the Toland man knew his meal's significance and accepted its harsh taste as part of whatever ceremony would follow. The seasonal timing adds another layer to the mystery. Pollen analysis indicates that the Toland man died in early winter or late autumn, when the bog landscape would have been stark and forbidding, when mists would have risen from dark water, and the line between the world of the living and the realm of spirits would have seemed particularly thin. This was the season when Germanic tribes traditionally made sacrifices to their gods, when the shortening days demanded offerings to ensure the return of light and life. Was the Toland man such an offering, a human gift to deities whose favor was essential for survival through the dark months? The geographical location provides additional context that deepens rather than resolves the mystery. Bogs held special significance in Germanic religion and mythology. They were portals to other worlds, places where the boundaries between realms grew permeable and gods could be contacted through ritual sacrifice. The dark water and shifting ground created landscapes that seemed alive, responsive to human action and divine will. To enter a bog for ceremonial purposes was to step into a space where normal rules did not apply, where human sacrifice could transform the victim into a messenger between worlds. Yet the Toland man's perfect preservation raises questions about the intention behind his death. If he was simply executed as a criminal or killed in warfare, why was he placed with such care in a location that would preserve his body for millennia? The bog's chemistry would have been well known to local inhabitants. They understood its power to transform organic matter into something approaching immortality. To place someone in such a location was to ensure their persistence beyond ordinary death, to create a form of monument more lasting than stone or bronze. The absence of clothing, except for a leather cap, adds to the interpretive challenges. Was he stripped to increase the ritual significance of his sacrifice, or did his nakedness represent a return to primordial innocence before death? The cap itself is intricately constructed from 8 pieces of sheepskin sewn with sinew, suggesting that even in his final moments, he was treated with respect rather than contempt. This was not the hurried disposal of an unwanted body, but the careful preparation of someone whose death carried meaning beyond mere elimination. Archaeological evidence from the surrounding area reveals a landscape rich with religious significance. Other bog bodies have been discovered throughout northern Europe, many showing similar signs of ritual death hanging, drowning, or multiple wounds that suggest ceremonial killing rather than simple execution. The pattern suggests a widespread religious practice that used human sacrifice to communicate with deities whose favor was essential for community survival. The Toland man may have been part of this larger spiritual ecology, a willing or unwilling participant in rituals designed to maintain cosmic balance. The scientific analysis reveals details that add poignancy to an already emotionally charged discovery. His hands show no signs of hard labor, suggesting he may have held a special position in his community, perhaps as a priest, a chosen victim, or someone whose social status exempted him from physical work. His teeth reveal a diet typical of Iron Age Denmark, with wear patterns consistent with eating coarse grain and occasional meat. His age at death was approximately 30 to 40 years old, enough to have experienced life fully but young, enough to retain the physical perfection that gods might require in their sacrificial offerings. Too extensive analysis that reveals its construction methods and materials. The leather comes from cattle hide processed using techniques consistent with Iron Age tanning practices. The plant fibers include materials that would have been available in late autumn, confirming the seasonal timing of his death. The rope's length and construction suggest it was made specifically for its lethal purpose, rather than being repurposed from some other use. Evidence of premeditation that transforms the Tolland man's death from accident or crime into something. Approaching ceremony. Modern visitors to the Silkeborg Museum, where the Tolland man is displayed in climate-controlled serenity, often report being deeply affected by his presence. Unlike Egyptian mummies, with their artificial wrappings and formal poses, he retains the appearance of sleep rather than death. Children sometimes ask their parents when he will wake up, while adults find themselves staring into his peaceful face and wondering what thoughts occupied his final moments. The rope around his neck becomes almost secondary to the profound humanity that radiates from his preserved features. The bog continues to yield secrets as archaeologists explore its depths with increasingly sophisticated techniques. Ground penetrating radar and careful excavation have revealed evidence of wooden trackways, ritual deposits, and other bog bodies that suggest the Tolland man was part of a larger complex of religious activity that spanned centuries. The bog served as a sacred landscape where communities came to communicate with forces beyond human understanding, where individual death could serve collective needs for divine intervention and protection. In the end, the Tolland man remains a mystery wrapped in leather and memory, a human being transformed by death and preservation into something that transcends normal categories of understanding. His peaceful face asks questions about sacrifice and acceptance, about the relationship between individual will and community need, about the prices our ancestors were willing to pay for divine favor. In his bog-darkened features, we see reflected our own capacity for both violence and transcendence, our ability to transform death into meaning and suffering into sacred purpose. The rope around his neck will never be removed. It has become part of his identity, as essential to his story as his peaceful expression or his perfectly preserved hands. In the museum's artificial twilight, he sleeps on, carrying within his leather flesh the secrets of a world where gods demanded blood and humans were willing to provide it, where death could be transformed into communication and sacrifice into salvation. His silence speaks louder than any words, reminding us that some mysteries are too profound for explanation, some questions too sacred for easy answers. In the underground palaces of China's imperial dead, where dragons carved from stone guard treasures that were meant to purchase immortality, archaeologists have uncovered burial preparations so elaborate they seem designed not merely to honor the dead, but to transform them into beings of jade and gold and eternal duration. These are the jade burial suits of the Han Dynasty, armor fashioned from thousands of precious stones and sewn with threads of precious metal. Cocoons designed to preserve the bodies of princes and princesses through the endless cycles of death and resurrection that Chinese cosmology promised to those who prepared properly for the journey beyond mortal flesh. The discovery of intact jade suits has been rare and precious, each find revealing new details about burial practices that consumed enormous resources and represented the pinnacle of Han Dynasty beliefs about death, preservation, and the material requirements for achieving immortality. The most famous examples come from the tombs of Prince Lu Sheng and Princess Duan at Nanjing, discovered in 1968 by soldiers blasting tunnels into a hillside, who suddenly found themselves face to face with treasures that had waited in darkness for over 2,000 years. What they uncovered challenged every assumption about ancient Chinese burial practices and revealed a level of craftsmanship that bordered on the supernatural. Each jade suit required the skills of multiple master craftsmen working in coordination over months or years to complete a single garment. The jade itself came from quarries thousands of miles away in Xinjiang and other remote locations, transported along trade routes that would later become part of the Silk Road. The stones were selected not merely for their beauty, but for their metaphysical properties. Jade was believed to prevent bodily decay, to nourish the flesh of the dead, to serve as spiritual armor against the forces that sought to dissolve human identity in the vastness of death. Each piece was carved and polished to fit specific anatomical requirements, creating a second skin of stone that would preserve the royal flesh within. The construction process reveals sophisticated understanding of both human anatomy and engineering principles. The jade plaques, typically rectangular or trapezoidal in shape, were drilled with tiny holes through which gold, silver, or copper wire could be threaded to hold the entire suit together. The drilling alone required tools and techniques that pushed Han Dynasty craftsmanship to its limits, creating holes small enough to be almost invisible, yet precisely positioned to allow the flexible construction necessary for a garment that must conform to the human body's complex curves and joints. The suits were constructed in sections: head covering, torso, arms, legs that could be assembled around the corpse and then sealed to create a complete jade cocoon. Prince Lu Sheng's suit, discovered in his hillside tomb, consisted of 2,498 individual jade pieces connected by 1,100 grams of gold wire. The craftsmanship is extraordinary in its precision and attention to detail, with jade pieces shaped to follow the contours of human anatomy so precisely that the suit seems molded rather than assembled. The face mask, carved from a single piece of jade, bears features that may represent either idealized human beauty or the specific physiognomy of the prince himself. The eye holes are lined with gold, creating pupils that gleam with metallic fire even in the artificial lighting of modern museums. Princess Do Wan's suit, found in an adjacent tomb, reveals subtle but significant differences that suggest either individual preferences or evolving burial customs. Her suit contains 2,160 jade pieces connected by 700 grams of gold wire. slightly smaller than her husband's, but no less magnificent in its execution. The jade pieces show different carving techniques, with some surfaces polished to mirror brightness, while others retain a more natural texture that creates subtle variations in how light plays across the assembled surface. Her face mask bears features that are distinctly feminine, with delicate bone structure and refined proportions that suggest either portraiture or idealized beauty standards. But the jade suits served purposes beyond mere preservation and display. According to Han Dynasty beliefs, jade possessed the power to prevent bodily decay, while nourishing the spiritual essence that must survive death to achieve true immortality. The stone was believed to contain concentrated life force, capable of sustaining consciousness even when breath had ceased and heartbeat had stopped. To be wrapped in jade was to be cocooned in crystallized vitality, protected from the entropy that dissolved lesser beings into dust and memory. The gold wire that held the suits together was not merely decorative, but carried its own significance. In Chinese alchemical thought, gold, like jade, was considered imperishable, immune to the corrosion and decay that affected other metals. To bind jade pieces with golden thread was to create a network of preservation that reinforced the protective properties of both materials. The wire patterns also served practical purposes, allowing the suits to flex slightly during the burial process, while maintaining structural integrity through the centuries that followed. The discovery of looted jade suits adds a tragic dimension to these archaeological treasures. Many Han Dynasty tombs show evidence of ancient grave robbery, with jade suits torn apart and scattered, their precious components carried away as individual treasures without regard for their original purpose or sacred significance. The torn gold wire and scattered jade plaques found in disturbed tombs speak of violence that destroyed preparations for immortality, reducing carefully crafted spiritual armor to mere valuable objects divorced from their metaphysical function. Yet even in their ruined state, the scattered components of destroyed jade suits retain their mysterious power to move and disturb modern observers. Individual jade plaques, separated from their original context, still bear the precise drilling and careful shaping that once formed part of a greater whole. The remaining gold wire, twisted and broken, speaks of connections that once held together more than mere stone bonds that were meant to preserve identity itself across the vast spans of time that separate life from whatever form of existence lay beyond death. The craftsmanship evident in intact jade suits reveals techniques that remain mysterious even to modern artisans. The jade pieces fit together with tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters, creating surfaces so smooth that they seem carved from single massive stones rather than assembled from thousands of individual components. The drilling patterns show mathematical precision that suggests the use of measuring instruments and planning techniques that left no written records. Some scholars theorize that the suits were planned using wooden or clay models that allowed craftsmen to pre-fit each piece before beginning work on the precious jade itself. The regional variations in jade suit construction provide insights into the political and cultural geography of Han Dynasty China. Suits found in different provinces show subtle differences in jade selection, carving techniques, and wire patterns that suggest local workshops or regional preferences. Some suits emphasize the natural variations in jade color, creating rainbow effects across the assembled surface, while others use uniformly colored stones to create more monolithic appearances. These differences may reflect personal tastes, local traditions, or evolving imperial standards that changed over the centuries of Han rule. The chemical analysis of jade suit components reveals sophisticated knowledge of materials, science that challenges assumptions about ancient Chinese technology. The jade pieces show evidence of treatment with compounds that enhanced their preservation properties, while the gold wire bears traces of elements that suggest alloying techniques designed to increase durability and workability. Some suits show evidence of repairs or modifications made during the burial preparation process, indicating that these were not mass-produced items, but individually crafted pieces that required ongoing adjustment and refinement. Efforts to preserve and display jade suits face unique challenges that reflect their original purpose. The suits were designed to contain and preserve human remains, not to be exposed to air, light, and the curious eyes of museum visitors. Removing them from their archaeological context inevitably alters their meaning and function, transforming spiritual armor into art objects. Yet the alternative, leaving them in situ, would deny humanity the opportunity to study and appreciate some of the finest examples of ancient craftsmanship ever discovered. Visitors to museums displaying jade suits often report experiencing something beyond mere aesthetic appreciation. The precision of the craftsmanship, the obvious investment of time and resources, the solemn purpose that guided their creation all combine to create an emotional impact that transcends cultural boundaries. Children seem particularly affected, staring at the jade faces with wide eyes and asking questions about the people who once lay within these stone cocoons. Adults often find themselves contemplating mortality and the human desire to preserve something essential beyond the reach of time and decay. The jade burial suits of the Han Dynasty represent one of humanity's most elaborate attempts to engineer immortality through material means. They embody beliefs about the relationship between physical preservation and spiritual survival that reflect sophisticated understanding of both craftsmanship and cosmology. In their jade depths, we see reflected our own longing for permanence, our hope that careful preparation and precious materials might build bridges across the abyss that separates life from whatever lies beyond. They remind us that the desire to transcend mortality through art, craft, and spiritual preparation is not unique to any single culture, but represents something fundamental about human consciousness and its refusal to accept the finality of death. In the museum lighting that brings out every subtle variation in their jade surfaces, these ancient suits continue their vigil, waiting with the patience of stone and the urgency of prayers never answered. They are testimonies to love that transcends death, to wealth that means nothing unless it can purchase eternity, to craftsmanship that approaches the divine in its perfection. In their silent presence lies the promise that some preparations for death are so elaborate, so carefully conceived, that they transform endings into beginnings, mortality into something approaching the eternal dot in the shadow of the Valley of the Kings, where the setting sun transforms limestone cliffs into gold and the desert wind carries whispers of dynasties lost to time. there exists a mummy that challenges every assumption about Egyptian burial practices and the peaceful passage that elaborate preservation was meant to ensure. Known simply as Unknown Man E, this unnamed figure lies in eternal agony, his mouth stretched wide in what appears to be an endless scream, his features twisted into an expression of such profound horror that even hardened archaeologists find themselves stepping back involuntarily from his display case. The discovery came during the great unwrapping sessions of the early 20th century, when Western museums competed to acquire Egyptian mummies and the public gathered in auditoriums to witness the revelation of ancient secrets. But when the linen bindings were carefully removed from this particular specimen, found among a cache of royal mummies moved to safety in antiquity, the usual excitement gave way to uncomfortable silence. Here was preservation without peace, mummification without dignity, a body prepared for eternity but condemned to spend it in the expression of ultimate anguish. The mummy's face arrests the viewer with its terrible vitality. Unlike the serene expressions typical of royal mummification, where embalmers arranged features into masks of divine tranquility, this face bears witness to something that went catastrophically wrong during the dying process. The mouth gapes open in a perfect oval of distress, revealing teeth that seem to bite at absent air. The jaw muscles, preserved by the desert's dry embrace, remain contracted in the position they held at the moment of death, suggesting that whatever killed this man left him locked in a final cry that echoes still across millennia. The eyes, though collapsed and darkened by time, retain an intensity that seems almost alive under museum lighting. The brow is furrowed in deep lines that speak of pain beyond physical suffering. This is the expression of someone who died in full awareness of his circumstances, someone whose final moments were filled not with the peaceful resignation that Egyptian burial practices were designed to encourage, but with terror, betrayal, or unbearable knowledge of what awaited him in death. But it is the wrapping that provides the most disturbing clues to his identity and circumstances. Unlike royal mummies, which were prepared with expensive resins, precious amulets, and elaborate bindings that spoke of love and reverence for the deceased, Unknown Man E was wrapped hastily in sheepskin, a material considered ritually unclean in Egyptian burial practice. The use of sheepskin instead of linen represents a deliberate violation of proper mummification procedures, a choice that would have condemned the deceased to spiritual contamination and difficulty in navigating the afterlife. This was not preservation, born of respect but containment, motivated by fear or punishment. The body shows no evidence of the careful evisceration and preservation techniques that characterized royal mummification. The internal organs remain in place, preserved by natural desiccation rather than deliberate chemical treatment. The absence of proper embalming materials suggests either extreme haste in preparation or deliberate withholding of the treatments necessary for successful resurrection. In Egyptian belief, improper mummification could trap the soul in a state worse than death, preventing both decay and proper entry into the afterlife. Historical analysis and recent forensic investigation have led many scholars to identify Unknown Man E as Prince Pentaweret, son of Pharaoh Ramesses III, who was implicated in a palace conspiracy that resulted in his father's assassination in 1155 BCE. According to the judicial papyri that record the conspiracy trial. Pentaweret was among the conspirators who plotted to kill the pharaoh and place a different heir on the throne. When the plot was discovered and the conspirators arrested, Pentaweret was condemned to death but granted the privilege of taking his own life, rather than suffering execution at the hands of others. If this identification is correct, then unknown. Man-E's expression of agony takes on new dimensions of meaning. Suicide by poison was the traditional method by which disgraced royalty ended their lives. But the available poisons of ancient Egypt were rarely quick or painless. Hemlock, arsenic, compounds, or other toxic substances would have caused prolonged suffering, muscle convulsions, and respiratory distress that could explain the mummy's expression of terminal anguish. The screaming face becomes not merely evidence of physical pain, but testimony to the psychological torture of a prince forced to destroy himself while fully conscious of his betrayal and its consequences. The sheepskin wrapping gains additional significance when viewed as punishment rather than mere expedience. In Egyptian cosmology, proper burial was essential for successful entry into the afterlife. But Pentaweret's crimes required that he be denied this possibility while still being preserved as a warning to future generations. The use of ritually unclean materials ensured that his mummy would serve as a monument to royal justice rather than a pathway to divine resurrection. He was preserved not to honor him, but to eternally demonstrate the consequences of betraying pharaonic authority. Yet the preservation itself raises questions about the complex emotions that motivated his treatment after death. If Pentaweret was truly guilty of regicide, why preserve his body at all? Egyptian justice typically involved complete destruction of traitors' remains, erasing them from both physical and spiritual existence. The decision to mummify him, even improperly, suggests conflicting impulses, perhaps the residual love of a father for his son, or the recognition that royal blood deserved some form of preservation even when tainted by treason. The forensic analysis of the mummy reveals additional details that deepen rather than resolve these mysteries. The body shows evidence of being bound at the time of death, with marks on the wrists and ankles suggesting restraints that would have prevented escape from whatever poison was administered. This contradicts the historical accounts that describe Pentaweret's suicide as voluntary, raising the possibility that his death was more execution than self-destruction, more murder than justice. The chemical analysis of tissue samples has detected trace amounts of compounds consistent with plant-based poisons available in ancient Egypt. But the degradation of organic material makes precise identification impossible. What remains clear is that death was neither quick nor peaceful. The muscle contractions and expression of agony speak of a dying process that lasted long enough for consciousness to register and respond to unbearable suffering. Modern visitors to the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, where unknown Man-E is displayed among other royal mummies, often report being deeply disturbed by his presence. Unlike other ancient remains, which inspire archaeological interest or historical curiosity, this mummy provokes visceral responses that transcend academic detachment. Visitors describe nightmares featuring the screaming face, dreams of being trapped in eternal anguish, or simply the inability to forget the expression of absolute despair preserved in desiccated flesh. The mummy's impact extends beyond individual reactions to influence popular culture and artistic expression. Writers, filmmakers, and artists have drawn inspiration from the screaming face as a symbol of unresolved trauma, eternal punishment, or the dangers of political ambition. The image appears in horror films, Gothic literature, and contemporary art as shorthand for suffering that transcends the boundaries of life and death. Conservation efforts to preserve unknown man face unique challenges that reflect the traumatic circumstances of his death and preservation. The extreme muscle contractions that created his expression of agony also created stresses in the mummified tissue that make the remains particularly fragile. The jaw, locked in its scream, is especially vulnerable to damage from vibration, temperature changes, or handling. Preserving him requires maintaining not just the physical remains, but the terrible expression that makes him unique among Egyptian mummies. The ethical questions surrounding his display also differ from those raised by other ancient remains. While most mummies can be exhibited as historical artifacts that honor the dead and educate the living, unknown man's eternal scream raises uncomfortable questions about consent, dignity, and the appropriateness of putting someone's worst moment on permanent display. His anguish becomes a form of entertainment, his punishment extended indefinitely through the curious gaze of tourists and scholars. Recent advances in facial reconstruction and forensic analysis have allowed researchers to create computer models of what unknown man might have looked like in life, before pain and poison transformed his features into masks of agony. These reconstructions show a young man with the refined features typical of royal bloodlines, handsome and intelligent, bearing little resemblance to the tormented figure preserved in the museum case. The contrast between these peaceful reconstructions and the actual mummy serves to emphasize the transformation that betrayal and punishment wrought upon royal flesh. The screaming mummy of Thebes remains one of archaeology's most emotionally challenging discoveries. A human being preserved at his moment of greatest anguish and displayed as testimony to the consequences of political miscalculation. In his eternal cry lies a warning about the prices of ambition, the weight of royal justice, and the terrible permanence that preservation can give to our worst moments. He reminds us that not all ancient mysteries are beautiful or inspiring, that some secrets are preserved precisely because they are too terrible to forget, too important as warnings to allow the merciful erasure of time and decay. In the artificial lighting of his display case, unknown man continues his eternal scream, his mouth open on words that will never be spoken, his eyes fixed on horrors that time cannot diminish. He is a reminder that death is not always peaceful, that preservation is not always blessing, and that some forms of immortality are punishments rather than rewards. His presence challenges our romantic notions about ancient civilizations and forces us to confront the reality that human cruelty and political violence are as old as human civilization itself. Deep beneath the Zanjan Mountains of northwestern Iran, where ancient trade routes once carried precious goods between civilizations and salt deposits formed through geological ages beyond human comprehension, miners in search of white gold have uncovered treasures far more precious and disturbing than the mineral they sought. In the dark tunnels of the Cherabad salt mine, where modern excavators follow veins laid down by prehistoric seas, the salt has yielded up its dead perfectly preserved. Human beings who entered these passages millennia ago and never emerged, their bodies transformed by mineral embrace into leather and memory, their final moments captured in crystalline detail that makes their ancient terror immediate and heartbreakingly real. The first discovery came in 1993, when miners breaking through a salt wall found themselves face to face with a man who seemed to have died yesterday. His hair, beard, and clothing remained intact, preserved by salt's desiccating power with fidelity that challenged every assumption about the passage of time. But it was his expression that stopped the workers in their tracks, eyes wide with what could only be described as terror, mouth open as though in the midst of a cry for help that echoed still through the mineral darkness. His hands were raised defensively, fingers spread as though trying to ward off some crushing danger that had indeed proven unstoppable. The Salt Man, as archaeologists came to call him, clutched an iron knife in his right hand and wore a leather boot still laced with sinew. Carbon dating revealed his death to have occurred sometime between 1500 and 1600 years ago, during the Sassanid period, when Iran was ruled by an empire that controlled trade between East and West. But the circumstances of his death remained mysterious. Was he a miner caught in a tunnel collapse, a traveler seeking shelter who became trapped, or perhaps a sacrifice offered to whatever gods governed the mineral depths beneath the Earth's surface? The preservation achieved by the salt environment surpassed even that of bog bodies or desert mummies. Salt's antibacterial properties had prevented decay while its desiccating effects removed moisture that would have allowed decomposition. The result was mummification more complete than any achieved by deliberate human effort. Skin that retained its texture and color. Blood remained in his tissues, preserved in a state that allowed modern analysis to reveal his blood type and dietary habits. But the first Salt Man was not alone in his mineral tomb. Subsequent excavations revealed additional bodies, each preserved with the same uncanny fidelity to life, each bearing witness to circumstances that ranged from accident to deliberate burial. One man was found wearing a gold earring and leather garments that spoke of wealth and status, his body positioned in a way that suggested careful placement rather than accidental death. Another bore evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull, his death violent rather than natural, his burial in the salt perhaps. Together in what appeared to be a single catastrophic event. Their positions suggested they had been working as a team when disaster struck, one man reaching toward his companions, another twisted as though trying to flee, the third curled in a defensive position with arms wrapped around his head. The salt had preserved not just their bodies, but the moment of their death, creating a tableau of human desperation that transcended time to speak directly to modern hearts. Archaeological analysis revealed details that added layers to these already complex stories. The preserved clothing showed sophisticated textile production techniques, with dyes that remained vibrant after millennia underground. Some garments bore patterns that suggested specific regional origins or social status, while others showed signs of repair that spoke of poverty or the practical necessities of dangerous work. The variety of clothing styles found among different salt men suggested they came from various time periods, social classes, and geographical regions. united only by their final resting place in the salt mines, preserving darkness. The tools found with the bodies provided insights into ancient mining techniques and the dangerous conditions faced by those who extracted salt from the mountain's depths. Iron picks showed wear patterns consistent with hard use against salt formations, while leather bags contained salt crystals that represented the last loads these men would ever carry to the surface. Oil lamps, their wicks still intact, spoke of the darkness in which they worked and the fragile flame that represented their only protection against the crushing blackness of underground spaces. But it was the evidence of violence among some saltmen that raised the most disturbing questions about their fate. Several bodies showed signs of deliberate killing, skull fractures, blade wounds, positioning that suggested execution rather than accident. Were these men murdered for the salt they carried, valuable enough in the ancient world to justify killing? Were they sacrifices offered to mine spirits who demanded blood in exchange for access to mineral treasures? Or did they represent something even more sinister, evidence of slave labor in conditions so dangerous that death was preferable to continued existence? The salt mine itself provided a setting that enhanced the mystery rather than solving it. The passages twisted through the mountain in patterns that seemed to follow ancient roots rather than modern engineering principles, suggesting that human beings had been extracting salt from these locations for far longer than historical records indicated. Some tunnels bore tool marks that predated the saltmen by centuries, while others showed evidence of deliberate collapse that might have been intended to seal certain areas permanently. The discovery of ancient wooden support structures, preserved by the salt's antibacterial environment, revealed sophisticated understanding of mining engineering that challenged assumptions about ancient technological capabilities. The wood came from species that did not grow naturally in the region, suggesting trade networks that brought specialized materials from distant forests. The construction techniques showed knowledge of load distribution and structural stability that rivaled modern mining practices. Chemical analysis of the salt formations revealed that different areas of the mine contained varying mineral compositions, some of which would have been particularly valuable for preservation, medicine, or religious purposes. The positioning of saltmen in relation to these different deposits suggested that they knew the mine's geography intimately, that they were not casual visitors but experienced workers who understood which areas contained the most valuable materials. The preservation of organic materials in the salt environment allowed for analysis that would have been impossible in other archaeological contexts. Hair samples revealed dietary information, evidence of metal exposure, and genetic markers that suggested some saltmen were related to each other. Stomach contents showed their last meals, while clothing fibers revealed trade connections that spanned continents. Blood analysis indicated health conditions, stress levels, and environmental factors that painted detailed pictures of their lives before death. Modern efforts to continue excavating the salt mine face ethical and practical challenges that reflect the unique nature of these discoveries. The saltmen are not merely archaeological specimens, but human beings whose deaths may have been violent, whose bodies deserve respect and proper treatment. Yet the scientific value of studying them in their original context must be balanced against the need to preserve them from further deterioration and the desire to understand the circumstances that led to their deaths. The salt mine continues to operate as a commercial enterprise, with workers who are acutely aware that their modern excavations might uncover additional salt men at any moment. The psychological impact on contemporary miners cannot be underestimated. They work in spaces where preserved corpses remind them daily of the dangers inherent in their profession, where every tunnel might contain evidence of ancient tragedy that mirrors their own risks. Local legends and folklore have incorporated the salt men into stories that blend history with supernatural explanation. Some tales speak of miners who angered mountain spirits and were transformed into salt as punishment, while others describe the mine as a portal between worlds where the dead continue their work in mineral form. These stories reflect the emotional impact of discoveries that blur the boundaries between past and present, between the living and the dead. The salt men of Iran represent one of the most emotionally powerful archaeological discoveries of modern times. Human beings preserved at moments of crisis with fidelity that makes their ancient suffering immediate and personal. In their salt-darkened faces, we see reflected our own mortality, our own vulnerability to forces beyond our control. Their preservation reminds us that death comes to all, but that under certain circumstances, even death cannot erase the evidence of human struggle, human courage, and human tragedy. In the mineral darkness where they rest, the salt men continue their eternal vigil, guardians of secrets buried deeper than precious metals, keepers of stories more valuable than the salt that preserved them. They are testimonies to the prices our ancestors paid for the materials that sustained civilization, reminders that progress has always come at human cost, and monuments to the resilience of human spirit even in the face of overwhelming odds. Their preserved faces ask questions about justice, opportunity, and the value of individual life that transcend historical periods to challenge modern conscience and contemporary values. On a windswept ridge overlooking the English Channel, where Saxon settlements once watched the horizon for dragon-prowed ships carrying death from across the North Sea, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of a massacre so systematic and brutal that it challenges romanticized notions of Viking warfare and forces confrontation with the savage realities of medieval justice. In a shallow pit near the village of Weymouth in Dorset, the skeletal remains of dozens of young Scandinavian men tell a story of betrayal, execution, and ritual humiliation that transforms an unremarkable field into a crime scene that has waited more than 1,000 years for its secrets to be revealed. The discovery emerged gradually from what initially appeared to be a routine archaeological survey ahead of road construction. But as excavators carefully exposed the contents of the pit, the true nature of their find became horrifyingly clear. The remains of 54 individuals lay jumbled together in positions that spoke of hasty disposal rather than respectful burial. These were not casualties of battle fallen with weapons in hand, but victims of mass execution whose bodies had been treated with deliberate contempt and systematic mutilation. All were young men in the prime of life, their bones revealing the robust physiques of warriors accustomed to the physical demands of seafaring and combat. Isotope analysis of their teeth confirmed what their skeletal morphology suggested: these were Scandinavians, most likely Norwegians or Danes. who had lived their early years in the cold northern lands before crossing the sea to meet their fate. On English soil, they represented the human face of Viking expansion. Men who had followed their lords across dangerous waters in search of wealth, land, or glory, only to find death in a foreign pit. But it was not just their deaths that marked these men as specialist was the manner of their killing and the treatment of their remains afterward. Every skeleton had been decapitated, their heads severed with sharp blades wielded by executioners who understood anatomy well enough to complete their work with single, precise cuts. The vertebrae showed clean slices that spoke of heavy weapons axes, or swords swung by hands that had practiced this terrible craft. There were no defensive wounds, no signs of struggle or resistance. These men had died kneeling, their hands bound, their fate sealed by circumstances we can only imagine. The heads themselves were found separately from the bodies, piled together in a grisly pyramid that transformed execution into ritual display. The skulls showed additional damage that occurred after death, deliberate strikes that shattered bone and suggested that the heads had been treated as trophies or warnings rather than simply disposed of efficiently. Some bore evidence of having been displayed on stakes or spears, with wear patterns consistent with mounting and exposure to weather before final burial. The absence of grave goods or personal effects raises questions about whether these men were stripped before execution or if their possessions were claimed as spoils by their killers. No weapons, jewelry, or coins were found with the remains in use for Viking burials, which typically included at least some personal belongings to accompany the dead into whatever afterlife awaited them. This systematic removal of identity markers suggests deliberate effort to erase these men from memory, to transform them from individuals with names and histories into anonymous victims whose stories would die with them. The location of the mass grave provides crucial context for understanding the circumstances that led to this massacre. The site lies along what would have been a major route between the coast and inland settlements, a place where Viking raiders might have been intercepted while carrying loot back to their ships, or where a landing party might have been trapped away from their vessels. The elevation offers commanding views of the surrounding countryside, making it an ideal location for ambush or for the kind of public execution that would serve as warning to other potential invaders. Archaeological evidence from the surrounding area reveals a landscape scarred by Viking raids and Saxon responses throughout the 9th and 10th centuries. Nearby settlements show signs of burning and abandonment that correlate with historical accounts of Scandinavian attacks, while defensive earthworks and weapon caches speak of communities organized for warfare against seaborne invaders. The Weymouth massacre fits into this broader pattern of violence that characterized the Viking Age in England, when raids and counter-raids created cycles of revenge that escalated into systematic brutality. The forensic analysis of the skeletons reveals additional details that deepen the mystery rather than solving it. Several men show evidence of healed wounds from previous battles, marking them as experienced warriors rather than untested raiders making their first voyage. Others bear signs of malnutrition or disease that suggest they may have been weakened before their capture and execution. The variation in ages, from teenagers to men in their 30s, indicates this was not a specialized war band. but a mixed group that might have included both veteran fighters and younger men seeking their first taste of adventure and wealth. Radiocarbon dating places the massacre between 970 and 1025 CE. During the Second Great Wave of Viking expansion, when Scandinavian kings like Sweyn Forkbeard and his son Canute were launching systematic campaigns to conquer English kingdoms. This timing suggests the Weymouth victims might have been part of these larger military enterprises rather than independent raiders operating on their own initiative. Their execution could represent Saxon resistance to royal Scandinavian ambitions, or perhaps Danish justice meted out to Norwegian competitors for English territory. The systematic nature of the executions raises questions about the identity and motivations of the killers. The precision of the decapitations suggests military expertise rather than mob violence, while the organized disposal of bodies speaks of authority capable of commanding obedience to distasteful tasks. Were these men executed by Saxon forces as revenge for Viking raids, or by rival Scandinavian groups eliminating competition for territorial control? The evidence supports multiple interpretations, but provides definitive answers to none. The ritual aspects of the head display add another layer of complexity to an already mysterious event. The careful arrangement of severed heads suggests ceremonial purpose beyond mere disposal of evidence. In medieval European cultures, decapitation carried symbolic meaning related to honor, identity, and spiritual fate that extended far beyond simple killing. To display heads was to make statements about power, justice, and the consequences of challenging established authority. The Weymouth executioners clearly understood these symbolic dimensions and used them to enhance the impact of their actions. Modern forensic techniques have revealed details about the execution process that would have been impossible to detect using earlier archaeological methods. Microscopic analysis of cut marks on vertebrae shows the sequence of blows that severed each head, revealing that some men required multiple strikes while others were killed with single, devastating cuts. The variation suggests either differences in executioner skill or deliberate choices about how individual victims would die, mercy for some, prolonged suffering for others. DNA analysis of the remains has provided insights into the genetic relationships among the victims that add poignancy to an already tragic story. Several men were related to each other, brothers, fathers, and sons, cousins who had joined the same expedition and died together in foreign soil. The presence of family groups suggests these were not random captives, but members of organized war bands that included kinship networks typical of Scandinavian military culture. The absence of Christian burial practices raises questions about the religious beliefs of both victims and executioners. The jumbled disposal of bodies violates both pagan and Christian concepts of proper treatment for the dead, suggesting that revenge or practical concerns outweighed spiritual considerations. Yet the careful separation of heads from bodies might reflect pagan beliefs about preventing the dead from returning to seek vengeance. Decapitation as spiritual insurance against supernatural retaliation. Contemporary accounts from Anglo-Saxon chronicles mention several incidents of mass executions of Viking raiders during this period, but none provide details specific enough to identify the Weymouth massacre definitively. The chronicles speak of battles, betrayals, and brutal reprisals that characterized the struggle for control of England. But they focus on kings and nobles rather than the common warriors who fought and died in their service. The Weymouth dead represent the anonymous majority whose stories were never recorded in contemporary sources but who bore the physical and emotional costs of their leaders' ambitions. The psychological impact of discovering the Weymouth massacre extends beyond academic interest to emotional responses that reflect modern sensibilities about violence and justice. Visitors to the excavation site often report feeling oppressed by the knowledge of what occurred there, while archaeologists describe dreams and disturbed sleep during the months they spent exposing and analyzing the remains. The systematic nature of the killing, combined with the victims' youth and the evidence of their terror, creates an emotional resonance that transcends historical distance. The mass grave at Weymouth stands as testimony to the human cost of the Viking Age, a reminder that the expansion of Scandinavian culture across medieval Europe came at prices paid in blood and suffering by individuals whose names are lost but whose bones preserve evidence of their final moments. In their headless skeletons lies a warning about the ease with which human beings can reduce other human beings to objects of violence, about the thin lines that separate civilization from barbarism, honor from cruelty, justice from revenge. The pit continues to yield insights as new analytical techniques allow researchers to extract additional information from bones that have waited more than a millennium to tell their story. Each technological advance reveals new details about these men's lives and deaths, ensuring that their sacrifice will not be forgotten and their story will continue to evolve as our ability to understand the past grows more sophisticated. In death, they have achieved a form of immortality denied to them in life. Their names may be lost, but their testimony to human brutality and resilience endures as long as archaeologists continue to study the evidence preserved in their bones. In the shadow of Peru's ancient Mocha pyramids, where the desert wind carries whispers of ceremonies performed when Rome was still a collection of hills, and the great library of Alexandria burned with accumulated wisdom, archaeologists have uncovered ritual implements that challenge our understanding of prehistoric spirituality and the relationship between earthly power and cosmic force. Among the most haunting of these discoveries is a dagger, unlike any weapon ever crafted for mere warfare, a blade forged not from metal but from rock, crystal, so pure it seems to capture and hold light like solidified starfire, its transparency revealing secrets while concealing others in depths that appear infinite and immediate simultaneously. The dagger emerged from Tomb 1 at Saipan, discovered alongside the Lord of Saipan in 1987 by archaeologist Walter Alva, whose careful excavation revealed one of the America's most magnificent burial complexes. But while golden ornaments and jade jewelry spoke of worldly wealth and political power, the crystal dagger whispered of authorities that transcended material abundant spiritual technologies, designed to manipulate forces invisible to ordinary perception, tools crafted for ceremonies that touched the boundary between human consciousness and whatever intelligence governs the movement of stars, the cycling of seasons, the delicate balance between life and death. The blade itself defies every assumption about ancient tool-making and the relationship between form and function. carved from a single piece of quartz crystal with techniques that remain mysterious even to modern lapidaries. It measures nearly 8 inches in length, its transparency so complete that observers can see through the weapon to whatever lies behind it. Yet this clarity is deceptive under certain lighting conditions. The crystal seems to glow with inner fire, creating the illusion that some form of energy moves within its crystalline matrix, waiting for the proper ritual to release it into the world. The handle bears witness to craftsmanship that approaches the supernatural in its precision and symbolic complexity. Carved from wood and overlaid with gold leaf, it depicts a crouching figure that archaeologists have identified as a priest or shaman in the act of transformation or transcendence. The figure's features are both human and otherworldly, with elongated proportions and stylized elements that suggest someone caught in the moment of transition between ordinary consciousness and whatever state of being allowed communication with forces beyond normal perception. The golden surface has been worked with tools so fine they left no marks, creating textures and details that seem to shift and change as viewing angles alter the play of light across the metal. But it is the blade's edge that provides the most disturbing evidence of the dagger's true purpose. Microscopic analysis reveals traces of human blood, absorbed into the crystal's surface in patterns that speak of repeated use in ceremonies involving the sacrifice of living beings. The blood has penetrated the crystal matrix in ways that suggest the blade was heated during its use, either through ritual fire or through some property of the quartz itself that allowed it to become warm when properly activated. The staining patterns indicate that the dagger was used to make precise cuts rather than crude wounds, surgical incisions that required knowledge of anatomy and spiritual preparation that transformed killing into something approaching divine communication. The placement of the dagger within the tomb reveals additional layers of meaning that connect earthly burial practices to cosmic beliefs about death and resurrection. It was found positioned across the chest of a secondary burial, a young man whose skeleton shows evidence of ritual scarification and whose teeth were inlaid with turquoise and gold markings that identify him as someone prepared for spiritual service rather than ordinary labor. The crystal blade lay oriented along astronomical alignments that correspond to constellation patterns visible during specific seasons, suggesting that its power was connected to celestial cycles that governed both human fate and divine intervention. Archaeological evidence from surrounding Mocha sites reveals that crystal daggers were not unique to Saipan, but formed part of a broader complex of ritual technologies that included mirrors made from obsidian and hematite, cups carved from human skulls, and trumpets fashioned from conch shells that could produce sounds capable of inducing altered states of consciousness. These implements were found together in ceremonial contexts that suggest coordinated rituals involving multiple sensory experiences, visual effects created by crystal and mirror, auditory stimulation from shell trumpets, and tactile sensations from blades that could cut flesh with surgical precision. The symbolic significance of choosing crystal for ritual blades reflects sophisticated understanding of material properties that extended far beyond mere aesthetics. Quartz crystal was believed by many Andean cultures to possess consciousness, to be alive in ways that metal and stone were not, capable of storing and transmitting energy that could bridge the gap between physical and spiritual realms. To craft weapons from such material was to create tools that participated in ceremonies rather than merely facilitating them. Implements that brought their own power to ritual activities and enhanced the spiritual effectiveness of whatever ceremonies they were used to perform. The technical challenges involved in creating crystal blades reveal knowledge and skills that seem almost impossible given the tools available to pre-Columbian artisans. Crystal fractures unpredictably under pressure, making it extremely difficult to work with precision. Yet the saipan dagger shows evidence of controlled knapping techniques that achieved edges sharper than any metal blade, while maintaining the structural integrity necessary for repeated use. Some scholars theorize that the blade was shaped using heat and pressure techniques that remain unknown, while others suggest that the crystal was specially selected for properties that made it unusually workable. The ritual context in which crystal daggers were used can be partially reconstructed from mocha art and archaeological evidence, though much remains mysterious and probably unknowable to outsiders who lack the spiritual preparation necessary for understanding such practices. Ceramic vessels and wall paintings show ceremonial scenes in which priest warriors use crystal implements to perform sacrifices that appear to involve the removal of hearts from living victims, with blood being collected in special vessels and consumed by participants in ceremonies designed to transfer life force from sacrificial victims to ritual practitioners. But the crystal daggers served purposes beyond mere sacrifice, functioning as spiritual instruments that could manipulate energy in ways that modern science struggles to understand or explain. Quartz crystal possesses piezoelectric properties, the ability to generate electrical charges when subjected to mechanical pressure that might have been known to ancient practitioners, even if they lacked modern scientific vocabulary to describe such phenomena. Ritual use of crystal daggers might have created electrical effects that enhanced the spiritual impact of ceremonies or produced physical sensations that participants interpreted as divine communication. The preservation of organic materials in Peru's desert environment has allowed for analysis of residues found on crystal blades that reveal additional details about their ritual use. Besides human blood, traces of plant materials suggest that the daggers were used to cut psychoactive substances, coca leaves, vilca seeds, and other plants known to induce altered states of consciousness that facilitated communication with spiritual forces. The combination of bloodletting and psychoactive plant use created ritual contexts in which participants could experience direct contact with divine powers that governed human fate and natural cycles. Modern attempts to replicate ancient crystal working techniques have met with limited success, revealing that the skills necessary for creating such implements required years of training and perhaps genetic predispositions that allowed certain individuals to work with crystal in ways that others could not master. Contemporary artisans using traditional tools have been unable to achieve the precision and finish evident in archaeological examples, suggesting that ancient crystal workers possessed knowledge that has been lost, along with the cultural contexts that sustained such specialized crafts. The psychological impact of crystal daggers on both ancient participants and modern observers reflects properties of transparency and light refraction that create unique visual effects impossible to achieve. With opaque materials, the ability to see through ritual implements while they performed their deadly function would have created powerful cognitive dissonance that enhanced the spiritual impact of ceremonies. Modern museum visitors often report feeling unsettled by crystal daggers, describing sensations of being watched or evaluated by the transparent blades, even when they are safely displayed behind protective glass. Scientific analysis using advanced spectroscopy has revealed that the crystal used in mocha daggers contains trace elements and structural features that distinguish it from ordinary quartz, suggesting that raw materials were selected from specific sources known to possess particular properties. Some crystals show evidence of natural radiation exposure that created internal structures visible only under specialized lighting, while others contain inclusions of other minerals that create rainbow effects when illuminated from certain angles. These special properties would have enhanced the mystical significance of ritual implements and reinforced beliefs about their supernatural powers. The cultural transmission of crystal working knowledge raises questions about the social organization of ancient Peruvian societies and the relationship between spiritual and political authority. The skills necessary for creating crystal daggers were clearly restricted to small groups of specialists who maintained their knowledge through apprenticeship systems that linked technical expertise to religious initiation. The concentration of such implements in elite burials suggests that access to crystal technology was limited to individuals who possessed both material wealth and spiritual authority. Priest kings, whose power derived from their ability to communicate with forces beyond ordinary human perception. Contemporary Andean shamans continue to use crystal implements in healing and divination practices that may preserve echoes of ancient traditions, though the specific techniques and beliefs associated with crystal daggers have been lost along with the civilizations that created them. Modern practitioners describe crystal as living stone that possesses consciousness and can serve as intermediary between human and divine realms. Concepts that help explain the reverence with which ancient Peruvians treated these ritual implements. The crystal dagger of Saipan remains one of archaeology's most beautiful and disturbing artifacts, an implement that embodies humanity's eternal struggle to transcend the limitations of physical existence through spiritual practice and material technology. In its transparent depths lies evidence of ceremonies we can barely imagine, rituals that transformed killing into communication and death into doorways to divine knowledge. It reminds us that our ancestors' relationship with the sacred was often violent, demanding prices in blood and suffering that modern sensibilities find difficult to accept or understand. Yet, in the dagger's crystalline perfection lies also testimony to human creativity and spiritual aspiration that transcends cultural boundaries and historical periods. The unknown artisans who shaped this blade from raw quartz achieved something approaching miracle, the transformation of inert matter into spiritual instrument, the creation of beauty from violence, the fashioning of tools that could touch the infinite while remaining grounded in human need for meaning and transcendence. Their legacy challenges us to examine our own relationships with the sacred and to consider what prices we are willing to pay for contact with forces beyond ordinary perception. High in the crystalline air of the Andes, where the earth reaches toward heaven with such desperate urgency, that breathing becomes prayer, and every step carries the weight of cosmic significance. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of sacrifice so profound and heartbreaking that it challenges every comfortable assumption about ancient spirituality and the prices our ancestors were willing to pay for divine intervention. On the summit of Mount Amputo in Peru, at an altitude where only condors and gods were meant to dwell, the frozen remains of a young Inca girl known as Juanita or Momia. Juanita tell a story of ritual preparation, willing ascent, and death, transformed into offering that speaks across 5 centuries to modern hearts unprepared for such perfect preservation of ultimate sacrifice. The discovery came when anthropologist Johann Reinhard and his climbing partner Miguel Zaret reached the 20,700-foot summit of Mount Amputo and found what volcanic activity had revealed: the burial site of a child who had been placed on this impossible peak as an offering to mountain gods whose favor was essential for Inca survival and prosperity. The body, preserved by temperatures that never rose above freezing, emerged from melting ice with a completeness that made death seem like sleep and sacrifice, like willing participation in ceremonies. Was perhaps 13 or 14 years old when she made her final journey to the mountain summit, chosen for qualities that marked her as suitable for communication with forces that governed weather, earthquakes, and the agricultural cycles that sustained Inca civilization. Her preservation is extraordinary in its completeness: skin that retains its texture and color, hair still arranged in the elaborate braids that marked her special status of Andean weaving art. She seems not dead but sleeping, waiting for some signal to awaken and complete whatever mission brought her to this impossible height. The clothing she wore reveals preparation that began months or perhaps years before her final ascent. Her dress, woven from vicuna wool so fine it rivals silk in its texture, bears patterns that identify her as someone prepared for the highest levels of ritual service. Thousands of miles away, carried to Cusco along trade routes that connected the Inca Empire's vast territories, her jewelry, silver pins, gold ornaments, textiles dyed with colors that required exotic materials, speaks of resources that provides the most haunting insights into Inca beliefs about sacrifice and the relationship between human death and divine favor. Analysis of her hair and fingernails reveals that she consumed increasing amounts of coca and chicha corn beer during the months preceding her death, substances that would have altered her consciousness and prepared her psychologically for whatever ordeal awaited her on the mountain's summit. The chemical signatures in her tissues tell a story of gradual transformation from ordinary child to sacred offering, from human being to intermediary between earthly and divine realms. The coca consumption reached levels that would have kept her in a state of mild intoxication during her final weeks, perhaps making the physical demands of high-altitude climbing more bearable, while also preparing her spiritually for transition to whatever existence awaited sacrificial victims in Inca cosmology. Combined with the effects of extreme altitude, the drugs would have created altered states of consciousness that might have made the entire experience seem dreamlike rather than terrifying, spiritual rather than simply fatal. The manner of her death reveals the careful balance between reverence and practicality that characterized Inca ritual practices. She was killed by a single blow to the head quick efficient, designed to cause unconsciousness and death without prolonged suffering. The positioning of her body suggests that she was seated facing the rising sun when the fatal blow was delivered, oriented toward the celestial body that represented the primary deity in Inca religion. Her hands were folded in her lap, her legs crossed in a position of meditation or prayer that suggests consciousness and cooperation rather than terror and resistance. The burial itself demonstrates understanding of preservation techniques that ensured her body would remain intact for whatever spiritual purposes required her continued physical presence on the mountain. She was wrapped in textiles and buried in a stone-lined pit that protected her from wind and avalanche while allowing the sub-zero temperatures to maintain. Grave goods included food, coca leaves, and small figurines that would accompany her in whatever afterlife awaited those who died in service to the gods. The location chosen for her sacrifice reveals sophisticated understanding of both geography and spiritual significance that connected specific landscapes to cosmic forces. Mount Ampato was considered a powerful Apua mountain spirit whose favor was essential for controlling weather patterns that determined agricultural success throughout the region. To place an offering on its summit was to communicate directly with forces that could bring rain or drought, fertility or famine, life or death to thousands of people, depending on the seasonal cycles that governed Andean agriculture. Archaeological evidence from the summit reveals that Juanita was not alone in her final moments. The remains of other offerings, both human and material, indicate that her sacrifice was part of larger ceremonies that involved multiple participants and elaborate ritual preparations. Gold and silver figurines, coca bundles, and ceremonial vessels were buried alongside her, creating a complex of offerings designed to ensure divine attention and favorable response to whatever requests accompanied her death. The altitude at which the sacrifice occurred adds another dimension to understanding the spiritual and physical challenges involved in Inca mountain worship. At 20,700 feet, the human body begins to shut down from oxygen deprivation, making every movement an effort and every breath a conscious act of will. Enabled participants to interpret suffering as sacred duty rather than mere ordeal. The journey to the summit would have taken days, during which the increasing altitude would have created natural, altered states of consciousness that enhanced the spiritual significance of the enterprise. Modern analysis of tissue samples has revealed details about her life before sacrifice that add poignancy to an already emotionally charged discovery. Isotope analysis of her teeth and hair indicates changes in diet during her final year that suggest she was removed from her family and community to undergo special preparation for her ritual role. The improvement in nutrition evident in her tissues speaks of care and reverence. Rather than abuse, she was treated as someone precious rather than expendable. Would participate in the psychological preparation for such a sacrifice would have required cultural frameworks that transformed death from tragedy into honor. Inca beliefs about the afterlife of sacrificial victims suggested that they became intermediaries between human and divine realms, gaining powers and status that exceeded anything achievable in ordinary life. For a child chosen for such a role, the prospect of death might have been presented as promotion rather than punishment, ascension rather than ending.